This morning, we are going to talk about access and final walkthrough. We tend to forget sometimes what we need to do with that. But first, I want to talk about the access. I've had some issues where buyers might think that they can just go at any time, bring the family, bring friends, measure for curtains, have a contractor come in. That's not really, the contractor is one thing, but that's not really what all of this is about. Whenever a buyer wants to bring family members through, they need to be aware before they're going to do, any inspections or final walkthroughs, or even when they're just going to merely look at the property. They need to be aware that those are the times that they can bring somebody with them. Most sellers are not going to just allow them to come in freely to do all those things at any given time during the transaction because, it's still their home and we've got to recognize that and respect that it is still their home. So I'm going to go ahead and read this paragraph. Access, final walkthrough, and utilities. Seller agrees to permit inspections of the property by inspectors, contractors, termite inspectors, surveyors, engineers, and appraisers selected by buyer as provided for in the contract, or inspections required by buyer's lender or insurer upon reasonable advance notice to the seller. So this week we had some family members who wanted to go through the property, and the agent said, your appraisal is going to take place on this day. Maybe you could go at that time. So they did, but when they asked, it was kind of frustration to them that they couldn't just go over and take a look at the house again. So we have to set the right expectations for our buyers in that aspect. They can't just go through. They can't just say, hey, my mom's in town, I want to show it to her. You can ask. You can always ask. But if the seller declines, we can't get upset over that, okay? So then buyer and selling broker may also be present during these inspections. Seller grants buyer, selling broker, and any inspector whose report prompted a request for repairs the right to enter and walk through the property and the right to have the utilities transferred to buyer within 4 days prior to closing. So what this means is, let's say that the buyer asks the seller to make some repairs. It's always a good idea to let the buyer know you have the right to bring the same inspector who prompted the repairs, the report for repairs, to come through with them during their final walkthrough to make sure that everything has been done, has been completed and done correctly. And, the walkthrough is within 4 days prior to closing. I understand that sometimes the buyer or the seller may not be fully out by that, let's say 4 days prior to closing. Sometimes they're not out until right before closing. But you've got to make the best decision, help your buyers make the best decision on when to go through. If there are some major repairs that were taking place, you probably want to do it 4 days prior to closing because that could allow a little bit of time to make some more repairs if they haven't been done correctly. If no repairs were made, let's say there's just a monetary adjustment, or maybe the toilet needed to be, tightened, or, anything small that had been done, the day before closing is probably a good idea. That way you can ensure that the home has been cleaned out, free and clear of everything. I have seen where the sellers were not completely out until closing. And as we all know, closing is defined as all the paperwork has been signed, but the funds must be at a minimum in the seller's title company's hands, preferably the seller's hands. But we're not talking about the buyer's title company. We're talking about the seller's title company. So the seller has the right, if possession is noted as closing on the contract, the seller has the right to still be in there until those funds are in their title company's hands. So we do have to be careful of that. If you're working for a seller, please let them know. It is a good idea to be out way before that. because the buyer has the right to do the final walkthrough to make sure the home is free and clear of anything. And it actually, the contract actually states too that ordinary wear and tear is okay, because we know that when you live in a home, you have normal wear and tear of the property. But making sure that it's cleaned up, because the seller is required to make sure that it is kind of swept up. Sometimes though, buyers want to do their own cleaning, but there's some things that the sellers might leave behind that is a little bit tedious, and we want to make sure that that is taken care of. Okay. So then utilities, the buyer needs to make sure that they're contacting the utility companies to ensure that those utilities are turned in on their name. That way they avoid any startup fees or reconnecting fees. If you're working for a seller, make sure that they are aware that the buyer has the right to do that. They can let the utility companies know that at closing, they're no longer an owner of the property, but give the buyer a little bit of time to be able to have them all switched into their names so they don't have any reconnecting fees. The purpose of the walkthrough is only for the buyers to confirm that the property is in the same condition, ordinary wear and tear is accepted, as I mentioned before, as it was the date of this contract, and that repairs are completed in a workmanlike manner. Seller will arrange at seller's expense to have utilities turned on during the period specified for any inspection and the walkthrough, unless the utilities have been transferred to the buyer. Sellers need to be told that they should not turn the utilities off, especially for inspections. And especially in the wintertime, you want to make sure that that heat is on, unless they're going to weatherproof the house, the plumbing, because there could be serious plumbing issues if a water line breaks in the house during the winter times when it freezes. Okay. So the seller needs to make sure that those utilities are on, and it doesn't matter if the property's vacant or not. They need to make sure that they're on unless there are other arrangements made in writing. Waiver of the property and improvement inspections does not waive the right to a final walkthrough prior to closing. The closing does not relieve the seller of seller's obligations to complete improvements and repairs required by the contract. So even if they, let's say they didn't do inspections, I have heard buyers or agents say, well, my buyer didn't want to do a walkthrough because, they didn't even do any inspections. Well, there's a lot that can happen between the time that they contract to purchase the home and closing. 30 days is a long time for anything to happen to that property. And that buyer really should make an effort to do a final walkthrough of that property. If they refuse, if they say that they're not going to do a walkthrough, or they feel that there's no reason to do a walkthrough, the walkthrough final walkthrough notice, form 2181, needs to be used. And it doesn't matter what type of buyer it is. It doesn't matter if they're out of state. It doesn't matter if it's land. This form should always be used for any buyers that we have all the time. It gives them the option to say, buyer acknowledges having waived the opportunity to conduct a final walkthrough of the property. They would check that first box on line 6 of the final walkthrough notice and sign it. On line 7, it says, buyer acknowledges having conducted the final walkthrough on this date and have viewed the property. So if they're good with everything, they would check that box and sign it. The third box on line 8, buyer acknowledges having conducted the final walkthrough on this date and has viewed the property and discovered one or more of the following items: are not in the same condition, ordinary wear and tear accepted, as they were at the time of the contract. 2, are not satisfied as specified and agreed to in the inspection notice and or the contract. 3, are not replaced or repaired in a workmanlike manner. Therefore, buyer requests satisfaction of the following items as specified below. Please list the issue and the requested corrections. So if you don't have enough lines on this, you probably need to fill out an addendum, like noted as addendum A. That way you can fill out exactly what, the buyer is asking the seller to do. When it comes to the repairs of what was written up in the inspection notice, You always need to be careful how that is written up. And I know that's for another conversation, but we need to be specific. But if buyer brings through the qualified home inspector that wrote up the report that prompted the repairs, ask them to come back through. They will charge, but it is a minimal fee and it's well worth the buyer's time. Okay. Any questions or comments?
Sometimes a buyer doesn't have the time and they'll ask the agent to do the walkthrough. The agent should not be doing the walkthrough. It's the buyer that does the walkthrough. We had an instance where the buyer asked one of our agents to do the walkthrough, and our agent thought everything was okay. But when the buyer moved in, they claimed that our agent missed something. So do not take that on your own shoulders of doing the walkthrough for your buyer.
That's right. And if you do this walkthrough, what needs to happen is they need to sign the final walkthrough notice stating that they have declined a final walkthrough. Because if the agent does it, which we never recommend, the buyer needs to note that they declined a final walkthrough. Okay. And I feel that an agent should never comment on any part of it, because that could get you into big trouble. Okay. Mark, is there anything you would like to share?
I just want to remind people on Downloop, I've seen some of the final walkthrough notices submitted, and let's just say there were some things they noted that they wanted corrected, but the seller has not agreed to it. They don't have the second part checked and signed off where the seller agreed to fix it. So I've been rejecting some of those. So when you do that, make sure you have the whole thing completed.
Yep. So we need a final walkthrough notice. Somewhere on it, someone has to say that they're satisfied with it. Otherwise, like Mark said, he will reject it. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
The contract itself, Laurie was talking earlier, the contract, the only time a buyer can get into the house after an accepted contract is during the building inspection and during the walkthrough. Sometimes a buyer, like what Laurie was talking about, is going to say, well, we want to come through and measure something, or we want our mom to see it. And the seller says no. And the buyer's reaction is, what are they trying to hide? And because we haven't set up the right expectations and letting the buyer know that the contract calls for this, and the seller might not have things going on, might not let them come back through the house. So I think setting up the right expectations is real key to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So making sure that you are having the discussion with your sellers and your buyers about the access and final walkthrough is very, very important. Like Norm said, when they say, well, what are they trying to hide? If you set up those expectations up front, they're not going to ask that question. The thing is, you can ask the seller, but if the seller declines, we all have to respect that. We have to remember that somebody still lives in that house. Even if it's vacant, nobody lives in the house, they want to make sure that the home is secure. But by people constantly going in and out, things can happen. So that's always a bad idea. We're at our 15 minutes. Everybody, thank you for joining me. And by the way, make sure you watch my video that's going to come out on Sunday night about the topics for next week. I'm really excited. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.